All right, I'm gonna go ahead and turn this over to Abby. Abby, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Marcos. And hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Abby Sambach, VP of Marketing here at HRSoft, the sponsor of today's webinar. As Marcos mentioned, feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A. We'll make sure to leave some time for them at the end of the webinar. I'm really excited about today's panel as we've gathered 3 leading experts from the compensation industry, from BetterComp, Trusaic, and HRSoft, to dive into the full compensation lifecycle as they discuss the importance of market pricing, integrating pay transparency into your comp strategy, and how to leverage compensation technology to manage the entire lifecycle. I will let them introduce themselves as they will do a better job than I will. So to get things started, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Glizelle Ditto, to kick things off. Go ahead, Glizelle.
Thank you so much, Abby. And welcome, everyone. Super excited for the audience that we have today. Again, my name is Glizelle Ditto, and I lead our client solutions and strategies here at HRSoft. I'm in my 6th year with the organization, and I've worked with and consulted with many organizations across all industries for a better part of 2.5 decades, both as a compensation and rewards practitioner and technology consultant. So I'm super excited about our subject matter today. And with that, I'll pass it over to Keith.
Thanks, Glizelle. Before I introduce myself, I just wanted to say thanks to Glizelle and Gail. It's been a pleasure working with you two. And if you folks don't know Gail and Glizelle, they're fantastic. Anyway, my name's Keith Fortier, and I'm a career compensation professional. I got my start at Watson Wyatt in the mid-90s. I've also worked at salary.com, Pay Factors, and now BetterComp. From a perspective, I've seen quite a bit in compensation. A couple of little highlights. I was the first comp professional hired at salary.com. I was with the team that developed Salary Wizard. I was also involved in developing salary.com's comp analyst, the Pay Factors platform, and now the BetterComp platform. So I'm really excited to talk about benchmarking and how that transfers over to pay transparency and strategy, because it's something that I don't know a lot about. And I know about my particular area, but it's going to be fun to talk to Glizelle and Gail about it.
All
and
right.
I'll pass it over to Gail.
Yeah, I guess it's my turn. Thank you so much, Keith, for those kind words. That was very kind of you. And I too, like you, am not an expert in everything we're going to be talking about. So my name is Gail Greenfield. I'm the EVP of Pay Equity and Total Rewards at Trusaic. And I've been with Trusaic about a year. And for those of you who are not familiar with Trusaic, we're a workplace equity technology and services company. And so we use the combination of technology as well as our support model to help companies achieve pay equity. So my background is in pay equity, and I spent close to 20 years at Mercer doing pay equity for Mercer clients, and now I'm at Trusaic. So again, similar, Keith, my background is in pay equity, so I don't know as much about market pricing. So I'll be learning along with all of you.
That's what I love about what we're doing today, because I think we're bringing together a great trifecta, because as we all know, we have our little areas of specialty when it comes to compensation practice. It's so broad. And I think the partnership between our 3 organizations is actually amazing, because we can really do a little bit of a deep dive into each of these areas with the 3 of us coming together. So thank you for that. With that, I'm going to go ahead and start us off with a quick poll, just to get the juice flowing and to start getting some participation out of the audience. So you should see a poll pop up on your screen. We'll take a few seconds here for you to be able to respond to that. And the question is, what type of philosophy do you employ to ensure pay equity? So whether it's external market-based approach or internal job structure and hierarchy, or a mix of both. All right. Actually, those results are great to hear, because I think we'll have a lot of content to cover on all sides, but it looks like the majority of the respondents here, an overwhelming majority, are using a little bit of a mix of both. So we'll definitely get into some of those details. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let me stop sharing my screen. I'm going to talk us through here. We'll start off with just a few topics that we had kind of prepared here. So I want to start actually with Gail and just looking at how we can actually, how do compensation strategy, pay transparency and pay benchmarking reinforce each other in shaping an equitable workplace? So I wanted to start with Gail on that, and we'll kind of riff a little bit on that.
Okay, so, before we get into kind of the meat of the discussion, I think it's important that we actually kind of level set and talk about the difference between market benchmarking and pay equity, because in my experience, there's sometimes some confusion about the difference between the two. So I think we should just get that out in the open now. And both are important. So just want to say that from the beginning. So benchmarking, really helps organizations ensure that they're paying competitively in the labor markets in which they operate. Whereas pay equity is really internal looking, and it's the practice of ensuring that employees' compensation is based on legitimate, compensable, non-discriminatory factors. So things like skill, effort, responsibility level, working conditions. And there's this very specific process around conducting a pay equity review. It involves a statistical regression analysis, and it's specifically designed to determine if demographic characteristics, so things like gender or race or ethnicity or any other demographic characteristics, are statistically related to compensation once we've accounted for legitimate compensable factors that we would expect to drive pay differences. So things like what role someone is in, how long they've been with the organization, how long they've been in their role, what their performance is. So we're really specifically looking to see if there are any statistical relationships between protected demographic characteristics and compensation. That is really what pay equity is all about. And if an organization conducts a pay equity review and identifies any disparities, then, the organization, ideally would engage in some sort of remediation. And that involves potentially giving a subset of employees pay adjustments to address the pay disparities that have been identified. So, whether an organization is market competitive or is paying equitably, those are really two separate, but both important questions. And ideally, an organization will want to ensure that its compensation is both market competitive and internally equitable. And I think those two together, making sure that you pay equitably and that your compensation is in line with the market, will enable you to be more transparent, right? It's, to me, that's really one of the core foundations of pay transparency. Is it's hard to be transparent about pay if you're not sure you're paying equitably and you don't know where you sit relative to the market. So I don't know, Giselle, if that's what you were looking for, but that's kind of, I just thought we'd set the stage a bit.
Absolutely. And actually that segues a lot into I think the rest of the conversation. I'd like to have Keith dive a little bit deeper into really what pay benchmarking really means too. I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but to get into that a little bit more, Keith, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, Gail, I like the distinction between equity from a transparency perspective as opposed to equity from an overall perspective. If you think about the word benchmarking for a minute, go a little higher in what we're doing. We're basically managing the biggest cost in an organization, and that's human capital cost, right? And so with that, there's two ways that organizations build this foundation so that then Gail can take and slice and dice her analysis, but it's done basically two ways: external approach and internal approach, and then a combination of both, which I think is very healthy. Let me talk about the external approach. If you're an organization and you want to find out that Goldilocks number, what other companies are paying so you can figure out what to pay your particular jobs, you have to look to surveys, right? You have to look to an external approach. And with that, you do something called benchmarking. Benchmarking is a process where you're taking your jobs, your very narrow, specific titling and responsibilities, and matching it to a broad job, a benchmark job. And the reason for that is every organization's skills and responsibilities are a little bit different, but in order to aggregate and make these linkages so that you can figure out if you're paying equitably according to the external market, this is a vital exercise, and it cascades down through everything else, like I'm going to talk about with internal analysis in a minute, and then also back to Gail's transparency and all the initiatives and the, tasks that are related to that. But benchmarking is the foundation of everything. And so what you're doing is you're matching your internal jobs to an external survey. You're seeing what other companies pay for your particular jobs because you want to be competitive, right? If you pay too much, right, you're leaving money on the table, right? You might get an entitlement population. If you pay too little, you're going to have high turnover and then recruitment costs to replace those individuals. So there is a Goldilocks number, and it's all predicated on benchmarking. From an external approach, I've just hit on a lot, but it's also important from an internal approach. In an internal approach, you're not so much worried about matching job by job. You've already done that with your market benchmarking analysis. Now you're looking at groups of jobs, groups, grades, bands, broadbands, whatever you want to call them. They're groups of jobs that are very similar. You've deemed them similar in responsibilities, and so they should have similar pay practices. So from an external perspective, you get to see what other companies are paying to ensure you're paying right, whatever right is for you. But internally, you're also making sure that your populations are paid comparable to each other, because you could have turnover just because of the fact that you have compression or you have like these inequities within different jobs. So again, it's all, I think, all cascades down. Anyway.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think that actually highlights the fact that neglecting any of these elements is really going to have a negative impact overall. We're thinking about in terms of, you mentioned turnover, how things are perceived within your organization. I think a lot of this too, because we're saying a lot of things that kind of get into some of the technical details of what we do in these practices. But it's also good to understand, I think we'll dive a little bit deeper into this in a moment, but to understand for the layperson who is in direct contact with your average employee, to make sure that everybody understands how this impacts them and what this actually means. And I think you had mentioned something around, making sure that you're paying right for your organization. So picking the right benchmark information, who are you actually competing with for talent, making sure that you're conveying that information to those managers and to the rest of your HR team that is in direct contact with candidates and employees, to make sure you're getting the right message across. And again, I think we're going to spend a little bit of time diving into that in a moment, but it is kind of a lot about perception around those things. So we have kind of the meat and potatoes of what we do to make sure we're doing the right thing, but then the perception of us doing the right thing is very, very important as well. And I'd say, especially as we're thinking about all of those different sources of information that people have at their fingertips now, between Glassdoor and LinkedIn and everywhere else, we need to make sure that we are not only doing this correctly, but conveying our message correctly to employees so that they're not going out and just looking for data everywhere. I think to that end then, Keith, I actually want to toss this next question to you as well. So you kind of touched on it, but how important do you think it is to know the source of that market data that you're using, and what's really considered good data versus bad data when you're thinking about?
Right. Well, this is something that depends organization by organization. Everybody has a different philosophy regarding this. I will say that most organizations, they rely on safe harbor compliant traditional survey sources, right? To ensure that data is accurate and everything flows through the organization. All right. But not all organizations want to purchase these surveys every year, for example. So depending on if you're not in a very hot industry, for example, you know that traditionally salaries have increased at roughly 4% a year. Take out last year was the highest one since 1985 or something. Besides that, 4% a year. So they feel that, well, we have our finger on the market. We don't have high turnover. We don't have any perceived problems. Purchase the survey every 2 years. So there's some philosophy regarding that. There are other philosophies where untraditional sources can be valuable and are used. I just mentioned a stagnant situation with a stagnant industry, but imagine that you're looking for a full stack developers. They're always hot, so you need to know exactly what those particular individuals are commanding for salaries. Now, the way to do that would be to look in your traditional survey, but oh, by the way, that data is at least 3 months old. And who knows? So what some companies will do is they'll look at that data in tandem with the empirical information from what recruiters are saying, right? And so they'll compile
Yeah.
data survey. So depending on, some organizations, that I think the hottest trend in the past 20 years is the fact that companies are going from a narrow approach when they look at market data, less regional, less metropolitan, and more national, because they're basically their population now, they can recruit from a national perspective with the work from home initiatives.
Right.
So, organizations feel like they don't need that narrow data because it's, easier to get national data, and then they can make informed decisions going forward from that. So, for the most part, comp professionals, they'll have their different, preferences regarding the data and where they get it from. But what we've seen, forever is more data is better data. So you get, recruiter data, you have your traditional sources, you have Glassdoor, and you can make informed decisions to ultimately do what you're trying to do, manage the biggest cost in your organization, human capital.
Makes sense. And I think that actually foots to some of the things that I keyed in on there. With the fast moving market that we're looking at, it does have to be a little bit more beyond our traditional surveys that might be dated, but looking at some of those data sources that might be considered more real time or more relevant to what you're looking for at that moment in time. But I think it's really the balance between those, right? It's making sure that you're not just looking in one place for data, because that will be skewed in a very specific way. And I think making sure that you're in the practice of looking for data everywhere. That's a great segue into kind of the next thing that I think we want to go into. We're going to go ahead and start another poll to get into our next topic. So thinking about the level of transparency that your organization has today. We have some brief definitions of what we mean by high, moderate, some transparency and no transparency, but really it goes from the scale of literally showing everything from salary ranges to pay structures and disclosing all of that information fully to your organization, all the way down to organizations that are really only disclosing ranges where they need to by law. And I know that that demand is increasing quite a bit as different jurisdictions are jumping on that as well. All right. So I'm curious, Gail, just looking at the responses here, it looks like roughly, a slight majority have some transparency. It looks like we're basically at least somewhere between moderate, some, and no transparency. There's still a large chunk of people, about a quarter, of the organizations out there really have no transparency. And very small percentage is what I would consider highly transparent. Is that what you kind of expected to see, Gail, just thinking about what you've seen in practice so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and by no real transparency, these are organizations where they're being transparent where it's required, right? So, we see a lot of that where organizations just aren't quite ready to be transparent, which is fine. Every organization has to determine kind of what's best for their particular situation. But it doesn't surprise me, although I will say that, we're moving in that direction, right?
Yeah.
The pay transparency train has left the station. So I would say, and you had talked a little bit earlier about kind of what are some of the risks of not, accounting for compensation strategy, pay transparency. And I mean, obviously there's the legal risk. You could be fined if you're, and I will say there's also some companies that aren't complying with the laws. They just aren't ready yet, and they're getting there, right? Because they know they have to do that. But there are some organizations that don't have pay ranges, for example. So they have to figure out what pay range am I going to share in my job posting? So there's a huge gamut. But I think another risk really is being left behind, right? So, organizations, I would hope that every organization on this call is at least working toward greater transparency, right? Even if you're starting from a point where you have very minimal transparency, that the mindset is we need to work toward becoming more transparent, because then you could just be left behind because your peer companies are likely doing that. They're likely working to become more transparent. And if an organization kind of falls behind, it might be harder to attract and retain talent. It could, erode trust that you've built with employees, and it could reduce employee engagement. I mean, there's a lot of, research around, the ramifications of failing to be transparent when others around you are becoming more transparent. So I think there's a big push to, at least for organizations, to push themselves to be, to move themselves along on that path to transparency.
Yeah, that's how it manifests. Yeah.
Sorry, go
I'm
ahead,
sorry.
Keith.
So, yeah, I was just gonna say that's how it manifests itself. Have you seen, Gail, like any examples, like studies of organizations that haven't been transparent and they actually are lagging the industry now or becoming less performing?
Well, I think that's going to be a couple years in the making, right? I mean, we're going to have to kind of follow, because we know where we're going, but a lot, we're still on this moving train. So I don't know that we can say that, definitively, but I think we have some kind of preliminary idea that employees and job, applicants, candidates, and the workforce more broadly, they appreciate pay transparency, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I started in my career, the idea that I would talk about my compensation with anybody was totally, I to this day have never talked about my compensation with anybody I've worked with, or family or friends. Only my spouse. That's it.
Right.
But yet,
and that's shifted a lot.
Yeah, but yet my stepdaughter, for example, her husband got a job, and she immediately called me up and wanted to know, is this a good, should he ask for more money? Is this a good offer? And then when she got a job as a lawyer, she called me, hey, is this a good offer? I need information about whether or not I should be asking for more money, and it's like such a 180 from my experience. So, the workforce of the future this is their expectation, right? Their expectation is they're going to have information about compensation so they can make more informed decisions about where they want to work. And organizations would be wise to just accept that, because that's simply the path that we're on.
I'd like to see that.
Add to that. Sorry, I was just going to add to that really quickly. I love this conversation. I think it goes back to that notion of our employees and our prospective employees are smarter than they used to be when it comes to these types of conversations, because there is so much information available at their fingertips from different sources. I think it goes back to that notion of, to your point, you know, when I'm looking at this from a recruiting perspective, you need to make sure that your compensation practices are part of your employer brand that you're putting out there, because everybody is talking about it to the extent that colleagues are talking to each other about what they're making. So even internally, there's kind of a forced transparency that's already happening. I think I think the purpose behind when we talk about those transparency laws is really to start to have an eye open to pay equity. That's the end result, right? But I think where we've been struggling recently is knowing how companies are starting to comply for the sake of complying and not being realistic about what they're actually putting out there, which makes some of that recruiting data a little bit skewed. And then in addition to that, then starting to have other companies say, well, but we actually do need to show competitively where we truly are. It's unrealistic to show a large range for a particular job. That makes no sense. The data doesn't mean anything. But I think as more companies are taking it to heart, you're actually starting to see more competitiveness around that competition for talent. So Keith, I know you had something to say. I did want to segue that into a little bit into the benchmarking and how you can actually use benchmarking to support those efforts around pay equity and having some transparent compensation structures. Just wanted to get your take on that too.
Yeah, I'll go to that. And so what I was thinking though is I was going back to those companies that aren't as transparent, and I'm wondering if they do indeed get hurt in the future. You see less people willing to go there or not. But to play devil's advocate, if I was a business owner, you know, I'm looking for any competitive advantage, I might be wary of publicly producing how I pay internally for my organization, for my assets, because again, I'm trying to manage my assets in the most cost-effective, productive way possible. I don't want other companies to mirror my, you know, actions. And that's what worries me about, you know, even producing like salary ranges, because what ends up happening is they get filtered anyway, because organizations just need to put a range out there. It doesn't really mean anything ultimately, because you can't determine what, you know, the pay practices really are, because they're so broad. Anyway, have you run into organizations like that?
You know, I think from my perspective, it's kind of interesting because, to your point, the transparency, we're still very cautious about being fully transparent, and rightfully so. There's a method to our madness in how we create our ranges and whatnot. I think what's more important than having visibility of hard numbers is more visibility for yourself as to where you are within what the company thinks you should be paid, but also why that range is what it is. Again, it kind of foots to your compensation strategy, philosophy. You're in a high demand job. We pay at X%, you know, we strive to pay X% of the market. These are the comparable points that we're typically looking at. Maybe not getting down to fully publishing your entire pay scales, but having some education around how you got there so that you can actually rationalize these things. And I know one of the things that isn't necessarily on our agenda to speak about today, but going above and beyond, I think what we've been focusing on is base salary and ranges around that. But it also lends itself to those total compensation conversations too. And I did want to understand a little bit about how that starts to come into play when we're thinking about either benchmarking or even pay equity studies, when you start to have very wide swings in variable comp and other perks and benefits and whatnot. That's a whole other layer to the puzzle. But from an external facing perspective, I think about organizations that I've worked with where they know they don't pay base salary very well, but they're very incentivized with their variable comp based on how well they do and how well their organization does. So they actually put that out there as their strategy, and they also will advertise what other perks and benefits you get for working with a company above and beyond a standard paycheck. So that's a little bit of a different spin on it too, but I have seen a lot of that where, again, they're hesitant to show their actual ranges to the public because they know they're low, but there are other reasons to be working for the organization that are still part of your total reward. Anything to add to that, Gail? Have you seen some things similar as well?
Well, I mean, I think you're speaking to, organizations in terms of kind of what they see as their comparative advantage, right?
Mhm.
So my recollection is I don't think any of so for example, in the US, all the states that have pay transparency requirements in terms of pay ranges and job postings, I don't think any of them have information, are requiring that you provide information on variable components of pay. But I would imagine that if that is an advantage that you have over competitors, and on top of that, you feel like maybe we're low on base and that's the only thing they're going to see in the posting, that you'd want to put your, best foot forward, right? That you'd want to share. And so a lot of organizations aren't just sharing what's being asked of them, right? They're sharing that, but they're also sharing additional information if they think that's advantageous. And not just for that reason, but like, for example, a lot of organizations are moving beyond what's required. And for example, in the US, a lot of organizations have decided they're just going to share pay ranges in all of their job postings, not just in the 10 states or so that either currently require or will require it, mainly because it creates, well, it actually in some cases can be administratively easier actually to put pay ranges in all of your postings rather than having to figure out where they go. Just like, no, we're just going to do it everywhere. So some administratively it can be easier, but also it creates, if you don't do that, it can create kind of an inconsistent experience for your current employees, as well as, any applicants or candidates where, if I am an employee in this state and I happen to see a job posting for a role in where I am, I can see where I sit. Whereas somebody in a different state that does not subject to pay transparency laws, they won't know that information. So you have some of your employees and some of your job candidates having information and then others not having that information. So some organizations are like, I want to create a consistent experience for the workforce and for our prospective workforce. So they've just decided we're going to do it across the board. But I think, Keith, you kind of touched on something about pay ranges. And there is some research that was done. It was actually some interesting research where it was actual like experiments where they had people look at pay ranges and ask them, how they felt about them. And people were very skeptical of wide pay ranges. They found those very disingenuous and, basically believed the company was trying to, obfuscate, pull the wool over their eyes by hiding what the actual pay range is, by giving something that's, unreasonably wide. But, it's interesting because when some of these pay transparency laws came into effect, particularly when in New York and California and Washington, because that was all around the same time. And so you had a large number of job postings that suddenly had to have these pay ranges. You saw a lot of media coverage about these ridiculously wide pay ranges. Now, some were ridiculous, like $1 to $1 million. Okay, obviously that's not a good faith estimate. But many of them were good faith estimates, even if they went from 75,000 to 150,000. People are still skeptical of a range like that, even though that might actually be the range. That is the range, because when these ranges were created, there was no intention of sharing them, right? I mean, that was not, if you knew when you put your ranges together that they were going to be shared publicly, you might have done it differently. So I foresee, if I just put on my little, futurist hat, I think we're maybe going to start seeing a narrowing of ranges because otherwise you really do risk credibility. I mean, people are really skeptical when they see these, again, what are probably real ranges, but they see them as, interpret them or perceive them to be unreasonably wide ranges. And I think, Lizelle, you were talking about the perception, and that's equally important, right? I mean, these ranges were created with the right intent, right? That at the time, in terms of figuring out how we want to place people based on their experience and give managers room for discretion, et cetera. There's a balancing act of a lot of different decisions around how we create our ranges. But now with them being public, potentially, I think companies are going to start rethinking kind of some of the philosophy behind the creation of those ranges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, I mean, kind of going to that point, it's an interesting point to think about when we created our ranges. We've all gone through those phases of companies broadbanding versus getting very narrow, and the whole concept of broadbanding and allowing for movement within that broadband based on experience and whatever those different factors might be. It's all with good intention, because that's how we're trying to manage these assets, to your point, Keith. But then when you start to have to publish those, or want to even publish those and give somebody some indication of, as an employee, where I am in that band, you do tend to narrow it based on their level of experience, their specific job, and things like that. So when we start thinking about the concept of transparency to the outside world, then I think there's a couple of things that might be at play. You mentioned something earlier, Keith, about visibility of the ranges specific to a certain area versus, like, are we going national now because we're really looking for talent nationally, and there are certain jobs especially that could be working from anywhere. But I think even what I've also seen is to take that a step further. Maybe you publish the actual national ranges, and a note saying, if it's required that you actually are in a particular region or a particular city or whatnot, that it's adjusted accordingly. I don't know if that's compliant by saying that, but it's interesting to kind of see how that's going to evolve as we get into this. I think I want to go ahead and just jump into the next area, and this is actually going to put to a little bit more of your area, Keith, as well. I do want to just kick off that next poll really quickly first. And let me make sure that that's coming up okay. So just curious, out of the audience, when you're thinking about performing any kind of benchmark analysis, assuming that you're doing that on a regular basis, are you typically doing that on a quarterly basis, a semi-annual basis, annually, every other year, or some other frequency, or maybe you're not doing it yet at all? So I'm just curious where the audience is here.
Just the Jeopardy music going on in the background while we
I
wait.
know, I'm thinking game show.
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting. Most people are pretty traditionally annual. That hasn't shifted a whole lot.
Yeah.
Is that what
So
you would have expected out of that, Keith?
Yeah, this is exactly what I expect. So if you look at the top end, the quarterly, semi-annual, I bet those are really hot industries. Annual, more your traditional. Maybe the every other year, those are industries that are well established. Maybe there's a good pool of talent and you know, the increases. You don't need to buy surveys every year if you have a good feel for the market. And going back to what we originally talked about, you don't have high turnover, you know, and costing that way because your employee population is satisfied. They're getting what they feel like they deserve.
Interesting. So it sounds like when we're thinking about how frequently organizations should be conducting these types of studies, you're kind of equating it to maybe the maturation of their particular organization, the specific industries that they're in. Are there some specific ones that you've seen that are really pushing towards more frequent analysis? And I mean, are there specific industries or segments that you're seeing definitely happening more frequently?
It's not surprising when I tell you this, but you know, the semiconductor industry right now is particularly hot, you know. So you see that. Uh, tr- think. Yeah, it's high tech, it's AI, you know,
All all the
I'm
hot
sorry, I'm
buzzwords.
apologizing for like there's no like surprises here, unless you folks have
Yeah.
noticed surprises too, but it's those hot industries, um, you know, as opposed to traditional manufacturing, um, you know, which
Yeah.
typically doesn't move as much.
I
And
think
you
that
know,
makes sense. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I'm also interested again in the future when the white collar jobs being able to work remotely from anywhere, you know, with
Hmm.
national data. I'm just, you know, I'm not quite sure of, you know, the need to be going very, very, very narrow, particularly when your base is like that. You know, so maybe it is, maybe we will see more of a not a quarterly or a semi-annual, you'll see more annual or biannual.
I'm
If
curious
there's
too, just
problems, you know, if you don't see the
right.
recruiting turnover problems, no inequities, Gail's not, you know, like the organization's not seeing it internally at all. You know, sometimes organizations will, again, it's a cost. And so surveys are costs. And so if you don't feel like you need to spend the money on it, they don't.
That makes sense. I'm curious because just to double down into something that you mentioned, maybe not industry specific, because some of these technologies and demand for certain types of talent, I think, is starting to be pervasive across industries. So you mentioned things like AI, and we're hearing that everywhere for different reasons, different purposes, applications, and expertise in that area. And of course, there's always going to be like, what's the next hot thing that every industry is going to start to dive into? But based on the competitive nature of some of those types of specific jobs, are you seeing that on the data side that the demand for that more up-to-date information in those hot jobs is actually increasing the supply of that type of data? And again, good data or bad data. I'm curious, even beyond the surveys, are there other means that people are starting to focus on getting up-to-date information for some of those hot jobs that are out there?
Yeah, the driving, you know, I mean, you have to be on top of the market, else, you know, you'll lose key talent. And so a way to do that is to look at the most recent data possible or what the recruiting market is telling you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but also, you know, the flip side of it is think about what I mentioned earlier, the Goldilocks number. Maybe an organization
Mm-hmm.
thinks the Goldilocks number is the base, the total cash market 60th. All right. In this case, and what you see is you see all of a sudden organizations pay at the 90th percentile. And when I say
Mm-hmm.
90th, if you're not real familiar with compensation, if you think about a normal distribution, the 90th percentile is just so much higher than, say, the 60th percentile. And that's the way they have to be competitive. They feel like, again, their philosophy is at this point in time for this job group, we have to pay that, else we're not going to be able to, you know, be productive.
Yeah. Yeah. So Actually, that segues into the other side of the equation then. I'm curious, as we're thinking about designing compensation strategies that are really supposed to actively promote pay equity, because you have all these competing demands within our workforce from a pay perspective. Gail, how do you think that we should encourage companies to design those compensation strategies that really are promoting pay equity in the midst of all of this?
Well, what I find interesting is when I hear, organizations are having to go and hire people, it may be less so now. Obviously, Keith, you're pointing to very specific jobs that are kind of hot jobs. Some of those activities, right, trying to meet the market, for example, it can potentially create pay inequities on a variety of different fronts. I mean, they can create pay compression issues, which really isn't a pay equity issue. That's a broader pay fairness issue, right?
Right.
But it can actually create pay equity issues. For example, if you think about an organization that, maybe they have wide pay ranges, right? And whether they're paying at the 90th percentile or wherever they've chosen to position themselves. And let's say that they bring women in at the low end of that range, and they bring men in at the high end of that range. If you do that over and over and over again, you could very easily create a gender-based pay inequity that could have the appearance of discrimination, right? So on top of kind of pay compression issues, then you may also have pay equity issues, to contend with. So that's why it's extremely important for organizations to be doing a regular proactive pay equity analysis to look to see if they have any inequities, and look in particular, for example, you can look at your recent hires and you can look to see to what extent are we creating pay inequities in our hire during the hiring process. So it's not uncommon for, if you look at somebody's, an organization's current pay equity situation and say, what is, our, pay gap, our pay equity gap, a lot of that is created at hire, right? They aren't necessarily created,
Right.
These pay inequities aren't necessarily created after somebody's entered the organization and they have this typical merit process. I mean, it can be exacerbated, of course, but the biggest determinant of your pay gap is generally what you decided to pay someone when they walked in the door. And so it is hugely important that when you make pay decisions, obviously you need to be in line with the market, but you have to make sure that you're paying people in alignment with, internally, right? As well as all of your new hires. Like, you have to look at the whole idea of, well, we have to bring this person in, especially in hot jobs. We got to bring this person in. I know we're going over the max for the role, but we got to get them. And you do that a few times, and that person, the individuals have a particular demographic characteristic, then suddenly you might have something that actually looks like a discriminatory pay disparity that a company could really get in trouble for. So you do have some of these competing demands where you want to meet the market, but in doing so, you might leave your incumbent employees behind. And so I think it's really important. And I think I was trying to look at the Q&A, and I saw a question about what happens if you have people below the minimum of your range, which is a really common problem, right? The market is changing and companies can't keep up. And in terms of job postings, what I've seen organizations not take their actual ranges, but take the range of the people in the role. So if, the lowest paid person in the role is making X and the highest paid person is making Y, you include that as your range. So that's one option. Obviously, the other option is to try, ideally, you want to get people into the range, right? That's like a lot. I guess what I would say is, for long-term pay transparency, an important part is creating kind of a strong infrastructure around compensation. And I think one of the pieces of that is making sure people are within the range for their role. And that is, I know it's a huge cost for organizations, to do that. But I think it's really important for that long term, in order to be transparent in the long term. I think it would be a wise investment to make sure no one is paid outside of the range. And it's also helpful for pay equity purposes too. I mean, it serves a variety of purposes to make sure everybody's within the range for their role.
I think that makes total sense. And I think you touched on a few things there in your response. I appreciate that. It feels like we're constantly talking about how all of these things are working together constantly. So in those industries where you have, or specific organizations where you have certain high demand jobs, you know, there's maybe a lot of competition out there for some of the talent that you're looking for, or even in those cases where you do have say in retail, manufacturing and whatnot, and things are kind of going along as they are, but there's still that competition for talent from, you know, a retail store across the street that can hire at a higher rate. And it's very common, even in those low entry level jobs, that you can go through the drive-through of a fast food organization and see what their starting rate is for somebody to start a job there. So it's becoming more and more common that people know what they're getting paid across the street. But to that end, if you are actually keeping up with your ranges, and making sure that you're also paying for the top talent that you need, you have to constantly be looking at that pay equity, the effect on the pay equity after those decisions are being made. It's not a one and done. It's not even a once a year, I don't think. And I think that's where we need to start leaning into the technologies that can help you, the consultancies that can help you with that exercise. Because I think what's happening in industries today, between inflation and all the other things that are happening outside of even just high demand jobs, things are shifting very quickly. But we can't miss a step in that process. To your point, I think it's having that strategy and that process in place and the tool sets in place, and making sure that just because you have this high demand job, that you're not missing the other steps when you start to make those hires. Does that sound kind of like what we're all trying to say here overall? Keith, did you have any thoughts on that too?
I completely agree with everything that you're saying. I think that Gail and her organization are particularly important, thinking about data and the way that we build reports, inequity reports. So if you can't, yeah, you might have problems, but if you can't interpret it and you can't put out a solid strategy about how you're going to fix it, you know, I feel like I made that joke in our notes about, you know, being Oppenheimer, you know, you're giving them the tools, but do they know what to do with them? You know,
Yep.
that's so,
Exactly. Enablement of technology in your tools is always number one in our industry, especially. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. I love the conversation that we've been having, and it's actually been honestly eye-opening for myself as well. I want to make sure that we get a little bit of time for Q&A, but just to kind of wrap this up, I want to understand from each of your points of view, how can companies measure success? Because I think that's one of the key points. We talk about all these things that we think we should put into place, but when it comes to whether it's paying money for consultancies or paying money for additional technologies or whatnot, how do you measure that we've actually been successful in this exercise in achieving pay equity as part of that broader compensation strategy? And I think for this one, I actually want to start with Keith, and we'll pass it on to Gail.
So two different perspectives, the hard numbers perspectives, which I've hit upon, you'll see it in turnover, and you'll see it in the productivity of your organization. All right, there'll be downturns if there's problems. You know, from a less number perspective, when you produce surveys of your employee population, are they intrinsically happy with the job and working in the organization? And you know, I mean, if we took care of equity from an external perspective. We took care of it from an internal perspective. We took it from a transparency perspective, and we took care of it from a DEI perspective. You know, hopefully that'll make everybody row in the same direction. That's my thought there.
Perfect. What about you, Gail?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with all of that. And I guess I would say to take all of that and create a measurement framework. I'm all about frameworks. So
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we don't have time to go into a lot of detail here, but at least for pay equity, but it could be expanded to other, you know, aspects of your compensation strategy, is actually outline specific, you know, measures associated with different parts of your strategy. And actually, this is a shameless plug. Trusaic, we do have a global pay equity strategy guide on our website, and it has specifically a section on creating a measurement and accountability framework. So if you know, again, I love a good framework.
Amazing. And I'd say to that end too, I mean, we've all been in this world of, you know, add additional tools. We mentioned that before, but it's the tools and the know-how of how to use those tools and the guidance that experts like yourself can add to the conversation and come up with what that framework should look like for your organization. It's never a one size fits all. It's knowing that your technologies and whatever support systems you have out there are really geared towards your specific organization and your specific strategies. But also, I think I mentioned this earlier, making sure that you're also not only having those analytics, but the education around how to utilize that. What does it actually mean? And how do we continue to leverage technology throughout the year to make sure that we're staying on track to where we need to be? So great, great responses. Thank you so much for all of that. If anybody is still on the line and has any questions for us, we'll take some questions right now as well until Marcos decides that we're cut off. But I did want to thank everybody for joining today. This has been an amazing conversation. Abby, I don't know if you have any questions that you see that maybe we want to go ahead and address that maybe we haven't.
Yeah.
And if we don't get time to do that today, we can certainly follow up as well.
Yep, we have a good number of questions. You have answered a few, so I apologize if some of them might be repeated, but here's one. Regarding the compensation technology today, I'd like to ask the panelists for their high-level recommendations on the core objectives and values to consider when implementing advanced comp and total rewards modules within our HRIS systems. Additionally, if there are any practical tips or action items we should keep in mind during implementation.
That's a great question.
That's a really big question.
Honestly, it's pretty, it kind of encompasses a lot of what we all do. But I think the main thing when you're thinking about your technologies that you're putting in place, you need to make sure that you first have your business objectives in mind. What are your overall business objectives? If it is currently pay equity, and it's supporting that process, absolutely make sure that whatever you're looking to implement supports those things. When it comes to your pay strategies, whether it's pay for performance and whatnot, it's understanding that you're still trying to solve for really the organizational's objectives overall, and making sure that you have that alignment. When you're thinking about implementing any kind of, whether it's advanced compensation technology and whatnot, you need to make sure that it's actually supporting what you're trying to do with your business, and make sure that you're working with the partners that can help you to do that, and that are not forcing you to change the way you're doing things because of some limitations within the solutions that are put in front of you.
Okay,
Gail, did you have anything else to add to that? Sorry.
Oh, the only thing I would say from, you know, if you're thinking about like a pay equity technology, I would say the most important thing is that you understand the underlying methodology, right? The methodology that's embedded in the technology platform. And if your vendor cannot explain that methodology to your satisfaction, then I would not select that vendor, because the methodology is really what is going to be driving all of the pay recommendations that come out of it. all of the decisions you might make based on it. So you have to be really comfortable with the methodology. So that would be my recommendation, at least on the pay equity side.
I'm good with that. What about you, Keith, real quick?
Just real quick, assess your sophistication. Not every solution is going to be able to meet your needs. And so if going back to that national idea, maybe you don't need all the bells and whistles, but if you have, intricate design, you're going to need a system that can support it. Else you're just, wasting your comp budget.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It looks like we
Abby,
can
did
have
you have
one more
another one that we
question.
wanted?
Yeah,
Okay, perfect.
one more question. And for any of those that we don't have time to answer, we will try to answer offline to you. But last question, what is a good method to manage comp ranges geographically, both North America, Europe, Asia? How do you handle that?
So what I've seen, it really depends on the amount of data. Salary structures are internally focused, but they're predicated on market data. And so with market data, you have some organizations that are global, and unfortunately, you don't have a lot of data in some of those locations globally. So it depends really on how much data you have to derive salary structures. What you see in the US is a little different. You get all different slices and dices regionally, family, because there's more data and you're able to do that.
Makes sense. And I think also that puts to some of the things that you had mentioned earlier, it's understanding your strategy when you're thinking about that globally and making sure that you are accessing data that is relevant for those different jurisdictions. I think the global market around data is definitely a big gap in a lot of organizations, but just working with the professionals that can help you to find the right data to use for your organization is important. All right. Again, thanks for staying over. For those of you that decided to stay over with us, really appreciated it. And we'll take note of the questions that we didn't get to answer and get back to you offline. So thank you. I'll go ahead and pass this back over to Marcos.
All right. Thank you, Gliselle, Gail, and Keith for sharing your knowledge and time with us today. This webinar will be available for playback for up to 90 days. Simply log into worldatwork.org and access your profile. Please allow 24 hours for the playback to appear. A reminder, we are going to email you a short survey here at the end. We highly appreciate any feedback you can provide to us.